The wind had been worrying the corners of the sod house for 3 days, a low moan that got into the bones and settled there like a sickness. It was a sound that promised nothing but more of itself. Lena stood at the cracked window, her body a thin argument against the vast, empty plains that stretched out under a sky the color of dishwater. Her son, Caleb, who was 7 and trying to be the man of the house, sat at the table whittling a piece of scrap wood into nothing in particular. His knuckles were white. Her daughter, May, was a small, quiet bundle on the floor, asleep in a worn blanket, her breath a tiny flag of life in the smothering quiet. Hunger was a hollow space inside them all. It wasn't the sharp, demanding hunger of a missed meal. It was a dull, constant tenant that had moved in weeks ago, unpacking its bags in the pit of their stomachs and making itself at home. The flour sack was a flat, defeated thing in the corner. The last of the salted pork had been a memory for a month. The garden had given up, its leaves burned brown by the sun and then ripped to shreds by the wind. All that was left was the wind, the dust, and the waiting. Lena traced a line in the grime on the windowpane. Outside, the world was shades of brown and gray, a landscape that had forgotten green. It had been a year since Thomas was buried on the rise behind the house. A year since the world had lost its color. He had left her with 2 children, a half-finished homestead, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The silence was worse than the wind. The wind, at least, was doing something. She had watched the horizon until her eyes ached, praying for rain, for a passing wagon, for a sign that God hadn't swept them from his mind like crumbs from a tablecloth. Nothing came. The trail that passed a mile to the south was a ghost of a road, unused and slowly being reclaimed by the stubborn prairie grass. They were an island in a sea of dust, and the tide was going out. Caleb's knife slipped, and he let out a small, sharp hiss. A bead of blood, impossibly red in the gray room, welled up on his thumb. He quickly stuck it in his mouth, his eyes darting to his mother, wide with a boy's shame at showing pain. Lena moved from the window, her joints stiff. She knelt before him, taking his small hand in hers. Her fingers were rough, the skin cracked like dry riverbeds. She said nothing. Words felt too expensive to spend. She gently pulled his thumb from his mouth and tore a thin strip from the hem of her already frayed apron. She wrapped the cut with a tenderness that felt ancient, a language passed down through hands rather than mouths. His gaze was steady on her face, his young eyes holding a weary understanding that didn't belong in a child. He carried whole winters in his eyes. "It's nothin'," he whispered, his voice thin as a fence rail. She squeezed his hand once, then let it go. She went back to the window. The small act had cost her something, a measure of strength she wasn't sure she could spare. She leaned her forehead against the cool, gritty glass. Beyond their small patch of failing land, the prairie rolled on indifferent. It would be here long after they were gone, long after the wind had scoured their names from the earth. It was in that moment, staring into the heart of that unforgiving emptiness, that she saw it. A shape. A dark smudge against the endless brown, moving slowly, unsteadily. It was not an animal. It was too upright, too deliberate even in its staggering. A horse and rider. The horse was stumbling, its head low. The rider was slumped forward, a dead weight in the saddle. Caleb was at her side in an instant. "Mama." She didn't answer. She watched as the horse, with the last of its strength, took a few more halting steps and then its legs simply folded. It collapsed in a slow, tired heap. The rider spilled from the saddle and lay still, a broken doll tossed in the dust. The wind picked at the edges of his long coat, making it flutter like a wounded bird. For a long moment, Lena did not move. It could be a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by hunger and despair. It could be trouble. A man alone out here was either lost or running from something, and trouble was a visitor they could not afford to entertain. But then she saw the stillness. The absolute lack of movement. Not a man resting, but a man laid low. Caleb's small hand found hers. "Is he dead?" "I don't know," she breathed. And a thought, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, pierced her mind. A dead man might have something in his pockets. A few coins. A knife. A pouch of tobacco to trade if a peddler ever came again. The thought shamed her, but the hunger in her belly acknowledged its cruel logic. But he might not be dead. He might be dying. And that was a different thing entirely. To let a man die when you could have helped, that was a line she hadn't crossed yet. Her soul felt thin and worn, like the knees of an old pair of trousers, but she feared making it thinner still. Thomas had been a good man. He would not have left a soul to the prairie wolves and the vultures. She looked at her son, at the worry etched around his small mouth. She looked at May, still sleeping, blissfully unaware. She was their mother. She had to be strong, or cunning, or cruel, whichever the day demanded. Today, she did not know what it demanded. "Stay here," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anything you hear." "Not for anything." Caleb nodded, his face pale and serious. He was a good boy. He understood the rules of their precarious world. Lena pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, a useless gesture against the wind's teeth. She slipped out the door, the sound of the bolt sliding home behind her echoing in the vast quiet. The walk out to the fallen man was long. The wind pushed against her, trying to drive her back, whipping her skirts around her legs and throwing dust in her eyes. The land itself felt like it was holding its breath. As she drew closer, she saw the horse was gone. Its life had seeped out into the thirsty ground. The man lay beside it, face down. He was dressed in dark, well-made clothes, now caked with dust and grime. They were not the clothes of a dirt farmer. A fine leather belt with a silver buckle, tarnished but unmistakable. His boots were high-quality leather, scuffed and worn, but they spoke of money. She circled him cautiously, like a wolf studying a fallen stag. She nudged his shoulder with the toe of her worn shoe. A low groan answered her. It was a sound of such profound pain that it cut through her fear. He was alive. With a strength born of desperation, she knelt and rolled him over. His face was a mask of dust and dried blood, a dark mat of hair plastered to his forehead. But beneath the filth, his features were sharp, his jaw strong. A dark, ugly wound stained his side, a patch of his shirt soaked through with a color that was almost black. He was burning with fever. She could feel the heat radiating from him even through the cool air. Section, his eyes fluttered open. They were a startling gray, clouded with delirium and pain. They tried to focus on her, to make sense of the shape leaning over him. His lips, cracked and bleeding, moved. A single word escaped, a dry whisper of sound. "Water." Lena stared down at him. This was not just a man. This was a burden. A mouth to feed when she could not feed her own. A sickness to tend when she had no medicine. To help him was madness. To leave him was to become the very thing. The prairie was harsh, unforgiving, and empty of mercy. She thought of Thomas, dying of a fever she could do nothing to stop. She thought of her children's hungry faces. The man's eyes slid closed again. His breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in his chest. He was a stranger. He meant nothing to her. But he was a human soul, and he was dying at her feet. She made her choice. It was not a choice made of hope or kindness or any of the soft virtues people spoke of in churches. It was a choice made of stubborn refusal. She had lost her husband, her crop, her security. She would not lose this last, tattered piece of her own humanity. Not today. Getting him back to the house was a nightmare. He was a heavy, dead weight, and she was weak from hunger. She half-dragged, half-carried him, her arms screaming in protest, her lungs burning. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts. Every few feet she had to stop, gasping for breath, her vision swimming. Caleb, disobeying her for the first time she could remember, had unbolted the door and met her halfway. Together, a half-starved woman and a small boy, they hauled the dying stranger across the threshold of their home. They laid him on the floor by the cold hearth, for there was nowhere else. May woke up and began to cry, frightened by the intrusion. Lena ignored her. She sent Caleb for the last of their clean water, the water she had been rationing drop by drop. She tore strips from one of their two threadbare bedsheets. She didn't know what she was doing. She cleaned the wound as best she could. It was a bullet hole, ugly and inflamed. She washed his face, revealing the lines of exhaustion and pain etched there. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps close to her own age. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words she couldn't catch. Names. Places. Fragments of a life lived somewhere far from this dusty patch of nothing. Once his hand shot out and gripped her wrist, his fingers surprisingly strong. His eyes were wide open, staring at her, but seeing something else. "Don't let him take it," he rasped, his voice raw. "It's all that's left." Then he was gone again, sinking back into the fever dream. Lena gently pried his fingers from her arm. She covered him with her own blanket, leaving only the thin one for her and the children. She sat back on her heels, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had brought this man, this trouble, this death-scented stranger into her home. She had traded her family's last reserves of water and warmth for the life of a man who would likely be dead by morning anyway. She looked at his still form, at the rise and fall of his chest that was already growing fainter. She looked at her children huddled together on the far side of the small room, their eyes huge and questioning. She had no answers for them. She had only an action. An act of foolish, desperate defiance against the emptiness. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. She only knew that he was here, and for now he was theirs to keep or to lose. The first days were a blur of fever and whispered words. The stranger, whom Caleb had started calling Silas because he had mumbled the name in his delirium, lay by the hearth, a still point around which their anxious world turned. Lena moved like a phantom, her face drawn and tight. She spooned brackish water between his cracked lips, bathed his fiery skin with damp rags, and watched the shallow, stuttering rhythm of his breath, expecting each one to be his last. There was no medicine, only her stubborn care. She boiled prairie willow bark, a bitter tea Thomas had said could break a fever, though it had not worked for him. She forced the dark, foul liquid into the man, a drop at a time. He choked and coughed, his body fighting her, but she persisted. She was fighting not just for him, but against the memory of her own helplessness at her husband's bedside. This time she would not just watch. The house grew smaller, the walls pressing in. The man's presence filled it. His scent of dust, sweat, and sickness mingled with the familiar smells of wood smoke and poverty. His unconscious mutterings became the house's new language. He spoke of ledgers and contracts, of a man named Brand, of a betrayal that seemed to burn behind his closed eyelids. He spoke of a woman named Eleanor, his voice softening to a pained whisper. Caleb and May were quiet observers. They stayed in their corner, watching their mother tend to the stranger with a fierce, silent concentration they had never seen before. May, who was usually a chattering brook of a girl, became as silent as a stone. Caleb took on the role of guardian, sitting by the door with his whittling knife, his small face a mask of stern vigilance. He was protecting them from the danger his mother had invited inside. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Lena was asleep on the floor, her head resting on the edge of the hard cot where her children lay curled together, when a sound woke her. It was a voice, not the rambling of a fever, but a clear, if weak, question. "Where am I?" She scrambled up, her heart pounding. The stranger, Silas, was looking at her. His gray eyes were lucid, the fire in them banked to embers. He had pushed himself up on one elbow, his face pale and slick with sweat, but he was awake. He was looking around the small, bare room, at the meager furniture, at the two small faces peering at him from the cot, and finally back at her. "You're safe," Lena said. The words felt strange in her mouth. Safe was not a word that belonged here. He sank back down, exhausted by the effort. "The horse." His voice was a dry rasp. "Gone," she said, simply. There was no gentle way to say it. The prairie took what it was owed. A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of grief for the animal. He closed his eyes. "My thanks," he murmured. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He owed her a debt. An unspoken contract was being drawn up in the quiet air between them. He had taken their water, their warmth, their safety. She had taken on his life. From that day, a new routine began to form, stitched together with raw thread. Silas was weak, but his will was not. He refused to be an invalid. The first time he tried to stand, he collapsed, and Lena had to help him back to his pallet, his arms surprisingly heavy and solid across her shoulders. The brief contact sent a jolt through her, a startling awareness of his physical presence, of the fact that he was a man and she was a woman, a thought she had buried with Thomas. She pushed it away, her face burning. He did not try to stand again in front of her. He waited until she was outside, trying to coax life from the dead garden, and then he practiced, his movements slow and painful. He would pull himself up using the stone mantle of the hearth, his jaw tight, his knuckles white. Caleb watched him, saying nothing, his earlier suspicion slowly being replaced by a grudging respect. The unspoken rules of their new life were simple. She provided food, what little there was. He, in turn, began to contribute in the only ways he could. He sat by the door for hours, sharpening her dull kitchen knife on a smooth stone he'd found. The rhythmic scrape and hiss of steel on stone was a new, oddly comforting sound in the house. He showed Caleb how to set a better snare, his long, scarred fingers moving with a slow, deliberate grace as he tied the knots. They caught 2 rabbits in the first week. The meat felt like a miracle. As Lena stewed it with the last of the wild onions, the rich smell filled the tiny house, a promise of life. They ate in their usual silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the hollow silence of hunger, but the full silence of shared sustenance. Silas ate slowly, methodically, as if relearning the act. When he was finished, he looked at Lena, his gray eyes direct. "You gave me your blanket," he stated, looking at the thin covering she and the children now shared. "You had the fever," she replied, her gaze dropping to her bowl. He said nothing more, but the next morning, she found his long, dark coat folded neatly on the end of her cot. It was heavy wool, worn but of a quality she had never touched. It smelled of him, of dust and faint, clean sweat. She hesitated, then pulled it over their sleeping forms. It was warmer than 2 of their blankets. It was an offering. A payment. A piece of himself. He never spoke of his past, of the name brand, or of the woman Eleanor. His history was a locked room, and she did not have the key, nor did she ask for it. Her own past was a sealed-off chamber of grief, and she respected his silence as she hoped he would respect hers. They were 2 people living in the fragile present, the past a ghost that sat at the table with them but was never acknowledged. He slept on the floor by the hearth, a respectable distance away. He never entered her small sleeping space. He never locked the door, but his presence was a better lock than any bolt. His stillness was watchful. She began to feel a sliver of something she had long forgotten, safety. It was a foreign feeling, and she did not trust it. The thaw was slow, like the first trickles of meltwater in a frozen creek bed. It happened not in words, but in work. The silence between Lena and Silas remained vast and open, but it was no longer an empty silence. It became a shared space filled with the sounds of their parallel lives. The rhythmic thump of her bread kneading, the steady scrape of his knife sharpening a fence post. He regained his strength in small increments, his body mending itself with the stubbornness of a wild thing. The first time he walked to the woodpile on his own, he returned pale and trembling, but he carried 3 logs. He dropped them by the hearth without a word and retreated to his pallet. The next day he carried 4. Section. Lena watched him from the corner of her eye as she swept the packed earth floor. He had a way of moving that was economical, wasting no motion. His hands, though scarred, were deft. He fixed the broken hinge on the door with a piece of scavenged wire, and it no longer groaned like a dying man every time it was opened. He patched the leaking roof above her cot with a mixture of mud and dried grass. He did not ask. He simply saw a need and filled it. These small acts of repair were his language. Each fixed latch, each sharpened tool, was a sentence. "I am earning my keep, I am grateful, I am here," Lena answered in her own dialect. She began saving him the best portion of their meager meals, the largest piece of rabbit, the thickest part of the stew. She mended a tear in his dark shirt, her stitches small and neat. She left a cup of the willow bark tea by his pallet each evening, long after the fever was gone, because she knew the wound in his side still gave him pain. Caleb's suspicion melted away completely, replaced by a quiet adoration. He shadowed Silas, handing him tools, asking quiet questions. "How'd you learn to track? Did you fight Indians?" Silas would answer with a grunt or a short, simple sentence, but he never sent the boy away. He showed Caleb how to read the clouds for weather and how to find north by the stars. He was teaching the boy to be a man in a way Lena never could, in a way Thomas had run out of time to do. One afternoon, as Lena was hanging laundry threadbare sheets that seemed more whole than cloth, she saw Silas and Caleb walking back from the rise where Thomas was buried. Silas was carrying a handful of late-blooming prairie wildflowers. He stopped at the simple wooden cross that marked the grave and stood there for a long moment. Then he laid the flowers down at its base. He did not know the man buried there, but he knew he was the husband of the woman who had saved him, the father of the children who shared their home. It was an act of profound, unspoken respect. It cracked something open in Lena's chest, a place that had been frozen solid for a year. That night, the nightmares came for him. Lena was woken by a thud and a choked cry. In the flickering firelight, she saw Silas thrashing on his pallet, his hands clenched, his face a mask of terror. He was caught in the ghost world of his past. "No. Brand, no, she's not part of this," he gasped, his voice tight with panic. Lena didn't think. She moved to his side, kneeling in the dirt. She put a hand on his shoulder. "Silas," she said, her voice low and steady. "Wake up. You're dreaming." He flinched at her touch but didn't wake. He was trapped. The ledgers, burn them. "Eleanor, run." "Silas," she shook him a little harder. "You're safe. It's just a dream." His eyes flew open, wide and wild with a fear that was not meant for her. He stared through her, seeing the ghost named Brand. He lunged up, grabbing her arms, his grip like iron bands. "He'll find you. He'll use you." Lena didn't scream. She looked directly into his terrified eyes. "No one is here," she said, her voice firm, pulling him back to the solid world. "It's just me. It's Lena. And Caleb and May. You were in her house." Her name, seemed to be the anchor he needed. The wildness in his eyes receded, replaced by a dawning, horrified awareness. He was holding her, pinning her. He released her so abruptly he almost fell backward. He scrambled away from her, pressing himself against the far wall as if he had burned her. I'm sorry," he stammered, his breath coming in ragged pants. I wouldn't." I know, she said softly. The firelight cast long shadows, making the small room feel like a confessional. She didn't move back. She stayed where she was, giving him the space he had retreated to. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. He killed her, he whispered, the words muffled, broken. Brand. He killed Eleanor because of me. Because of the money. There it was. The key to the locked room, offered in a moment of broken terror. Lena didn't ask for more. She didn't press. The story was his to tell or not tell. She simply sat in the flickering darkness, a silent witness to his grief. The air was thick with it, a sorrow so immense it seemed to suck the very warmth from the fire. After a long time he lifted his head. His face was ravaged, but his eyes were clear. Why? He asked, his voice raw. Why did you take me in? You have nothing. You risk everything for a stranger. Lena looked at her hands resting in her lap. They were chapped and worn, a map of her life's labors. My husband died of a fever, she said, her voice quiet. I couldn't do anything. I just watched. I suppose I got tired of watching things die. She finally looked at him. The space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with shared wounds, with the ghosts of a man named Thomas and a woman named Eleanor. He held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw not a stranger but a reflection of her own loss. He nodded slowly. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. The word was insufficient for what had passed between them. He had shared a piece of his brokenness, and she had held it without flinching. It was a foundation. A fragile, trembling trust being built in the ruins of their separate lives. The first harbinger of the past was the dust. Not the usual dust that was a constant companion on the plains, but a different kind, a purposeful cloud, low and dark on the western horizon, moving with a speed that was not natural. Lena saw it from the garden where she was trying to turn the soil for a hopeful winter planting. Her hand tightened on the handle of the spade. It was Ryder's. More than one. Silas was near the soddy, resetting a loose stone at the foundation. He saw it at the same moment she did. He straightened slowly, his body going rigid. He didn't look at the horizon. He looked at her and then at the house where the children were playing. His face became a mask of cold stone, all the warmth and weariness of the past weeks gone, replaced by something hard and dangerous. The dying man was gone. In his place stood a man ready for a fight. Lena, he said, his voice low and flat. Take the children. Go inside. Bar the door. Do not come out. Who is it? She asked, though she already knew the answer. It was the ghost from his nightmares riding out of the west. It was Brand. It's trouble I brought to your door, he said, his eyes never leaving the approaching dust cloud. I aim to see it doesn't cross the threshold. He started walking towards the house, his limp more pronounced. He went inside and emerged a moment later. He was wearing his gun belt. The silver on the buckle glinted dully in the pale sunlight. She hadn't known he had a gun. He must have hidden it in his bedroll. It looked natural on his hip, an extension of his body. Silas, you're not healed, she protested, following him. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. This fragile piece they had built was about to be shattered. I'm healed enough, he said, his voice grim. He checked the cylinder of the revolver, his movements economical and sure. Go inside. Please. Section, the please was what did it. It was a plea, not a command. It acknowledged that this was her home, her land, her choice. She herded a frightened Caleb and a crying May inside, her hands trembling. She slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, its solid thud a frail sound against the coming storm. She pushed the children into the corner, whispering for them to be quiet, to be brave. Then she went to the cracked window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The riders resolved out of the dust. There were 3 of them. The man in the lead was large, dressed in expensive city clothes that looked out of place on the rugged plains. He rode a magnificent black horse, its coat gleaming with sweat. Even from this distance, Lena could see the arrogance in the way he sat his saddle. This was Brand. The other 2 were rougher men, hired guns with flat, merciless eyes. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from where Silas stood waiting. He hadn't drawn his weapon. He just stood there, his feet planted in the dirt of her yard, a solitary, unmovable object. Brand dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He smiled, a thin, unpleasant curving of his lips. It was a smile that held no warmth, only satisfaction. Silas, he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. It was a rich, confident voice, the voice of a man used to owning things. I have to admit, I'm impressed. I thought the buzzards would have picked you clean by now. You always were stubborn. Silas said nothing. He just watched, his gray eyes narrowed. His stillness was unnerving. It was the stillness of a coiled snake. Bran took a few steps closer, dusting off his coat. He looked past Silas, his gaze sweeping over the poor sod house, the failing garden, the general air of poverty. A look of contemptuous pity crossed his face. This is what you ran to? A mud hut at the end of the world? I'll grant you it's a good place to hide. But you can't hide from what you owe me, Silas. I don't owe you anything, Bran, Silas said, his voice deceptively calm. The ledgers proved that. Bran laughed, a short, ugly sound. The ledgers you stole? The ledgers you used to ruin me? Oh, you owe me. You owe me my reputation. You owe me my fortune. And since I can't get that back, I'll take it out of your hide. He paused, his eyes flicking to the house again. And everything in it. He took another step. I heard you weren't alone. Picked up a little sawbuster widow, did you? I have to wonder what she's doing with a man like you. A thief. A man responsible for his own fiancée's death. The mention of Eleanor was a deliberate cruelty. A knife twisted in an open wound. Through the window, Lena saw Silas's hand twitch, moving almost imperceptibly closer to the butt of his gun. This is my property, Bran said, his voice hardening. He gestured expansively, as if he owned the very air they breathed. I bought the land rights to this whole section yesterday in town. Title, deed, everything. Apparently, this little homestead defaulted on its taxes, which means this house, this dirt, and anyone on it belongs to me now, including your little pet project. Fear, sharp and icy, lanced through Lena. He was lying. He had to be, but the confidence in his voice was terrifying. He was a man who bent the world to his will, who made his own truth with money and power. He saw them as nothing more than objects on a piece of land he had acquired. She's not part of this, Silas said, his voice a low growl. This is between you and me. Everything is part of this now, Bran countered, his smile widening. You took what was mine, Silas. Now I'll take what's yours. Get out of my way. I want to meet the lady of the house. He started to walk forward, intending to push past Silas and go to the door. And from her place at the window, watching the man who had brought ruin to her door, a fire ignited in Lena. It was a rage born of a year of loss, of hunger, of fear, of being ground down by the world until she was almost nothing. She had been a victim. She had been a survivor. But she would not be property. Not again. Not ever. Before she even knew what she was doing, she was moving. She slid the bar from the door, her hands steady. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but the anger was hotter. She grabbed the one thing she could think of, the one weapon she owned. The heavy iron poker from the hearth. The door swung open with a screech. All four men turned to look. Silas's face was a mask of shock and dismay. Bran's was one of cruel amusement. Lena stepped out of the house and stood on the packed earth of her porch. She was barefoot in her patched and faded dress, her hair coming loose from its bun. She held the iron poker in front of her, its weight unfamiliar but solid in her hands. She stood beside Silas, not behind him. They were a line. A broken, desperate, but unyielding line. Bran's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes taking in the fierce, protective blaze in her expression. He had expected a cowering, frightened woman. He had not expected this. Well, he said, recovering quickly. The mouse comes out of her hole. Ma'am, my business is with him. But since you're living on my land, I suggest you go back inside and wait quietly. I'll deal with you later. Lena's heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break them. Her throat was dry, but she lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his without flinching. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried across the yard with the weight of absolute conviction. This is my home, she said. And this is my family. You are not welcome here. Leave. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Bran stared at her, his amusement curdling into genuine anger. He had been dismissed. By a woman. A poor, dirt-farming nobody. It was an insult to his very being. His face darkened, the civility vanishing completely. Family, he sneered, turning his venom on Silas. You didn't tell me you'd replaced Eleanor so quickly. Though I have to say, your standards have dropped considerably. That was the breaking point. Silas didn't lunge. He didn't shout. His movement was a blur of lethal grace. One moment he was standing still, the next his gun was in his hand, cocked and aimed squarely at Bran's chest. The click of the hammer being pulled back was the loudest sound in the world. Say her name again, Silas whispered, his voice deadly soft. and I will scatter your brains all over this yard. Brand's hired guns, who had been watching with detached interest, suddenly tensed, their hands dropping to their own pistols. But they didn't draw. There was something in Silas's stance, in the cold finality in his eyes, that gave them pause. This was not a bluff. Brand held up a hand, a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. He had pushed too far. He had wanted to humiliate Silas, to break him, but he had misjudged the man's core of iron. Easy, Silas. No need for that. We're civilized men. He isn't civilized, Lena said, her voice cutting through the tension. She took a step forward, the poker held tight in her grip. Her eyes were locked on Brand. He's a bully and a coward. He comes here with his hired men because he's afraid to face one man on his own. He talks about land deeds and money because his soul is empty. There is nothing of value in him. Every word was a stone she threw at him. She was no longer just defending her home. She was passing judgment. She, who had been judged and found wanting by the world, was now the one on the bench. Brand's face turned a mottled red. He was being dismantled, piece by piece, by a man he thought he had broken and a woman he considered less than dirt. His pride, the very thing that drove him, could not endure it. "You little bitch," he snarled, losing all composure. He took a step toward her, his hand raised to strike. It was the last mistake he would make that day. As his hand came up, Lena did not flinch or retreat. She swung the heavy iron poker in a short, vicious arc, putting all of her fear and rage and grief into the blow. The poker connected with Brand's outstretched arm with a sickening crack. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and agony, and staggered back, clutching his broken wrist. The two gunmen froze, their hands hovering over their holsters. Their job was to intimidate and threaten, maybe even to shoot a man in a fair fight. They were not paid to get into a brawl with a wild-eyed woman defending her home. They looked from their screaming boss to Silas, whose gun had not wavered from Brand's chest, to Lena, who stood ready to swing again, her face pale but resolute. They exchanged a look. This was not worth dying for. "Get him on his horse," Silas commanded, his voice like cracking ice. "And get off this land." One of the men nodded curtly. They holstered their weapons and helped their whimpering boss back onto his horse. Brand, cradling his shattered arm, glared at them with pure hatred, his face contorted in pain and humiliation. "This isn't over, Silas," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I'll come back. I'll burn you out." "You do that," Silas said calmly. "And they'll find what's left of you in the spring." The gunmen didn't need any more convincing. They turned their horses and rode away, dragging their wounded pride and their wounded employer with them, leaving a trail of fading dust and empty threats. Lena and Silas stood in the yard, watching them go until they were just specks on the horizon. The silence rushed back in, but it was a new kind of silence. The danger was gone. The threat had been met and turned away. Lena's arm began to tremble, the adrenaline draining out of her. The iron poker suddenly felt impossibly heavy. It slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the dirt with a soft thud. She wrapped her arms around herself, a tremor running through her entire body. Silas uncocked his pistol and slid it back into its holster. He turned to her. His face was no longer a stone mask. It was full of an emotion she couldn't quite name, awe, gratitude, a fierce and tender concern. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before he gently touched her shoulder. "You didn't run," he said, his voice soft. "It's my home," she whispered, her own voice shaking. "I was scared," he admitted, his gaze holding hers. It was a stunning confession from this man of iron and silence. "I know," she replied, because she had been terrified too. "So was I." He didn't say anything else. He just stood there with his hand on her shoulder, a solid, grounding presence. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. In the doorway, Caleb and May appeared, their small faces pale. Lena looked from the children to Silas, and for the first time in a very long time, the word she had thrown at Brand felt true. Family. This strange, wounded, patchwork group of 4 souls standing together against the vast, empty prairie. They had faced the fire, and they were all still standing. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress they had defended together. The dust settled. The wind died down. In the aftermath of the storm, a profound quiet descended on the homestead, a quiet that was not empty but full of the unspoken things that had been forged in the crucible of that afternoon. They did not speak of what had happened. There were no words for the terror, the rage, or the fierce, unexpected pride. The story was told in their movements in the spaces between them. Lena picked up the iron poker and carried it back inside, her steps sure and steady. It was no longer just a tool for the fire, it was a symbol of her own reclaimed strength. Silas followed her in, his limp more noticeable now that the danger had passed. He sank onto his pallet by the hearth, the exhaustion of the confrontation settling deep into his bones. He laid his gun belt beside him, a sleeping snake. The children, seeing that the monsters had been chased away, finally emerged from their corner. May ran to her mother, burying her face in Lena's dress. Caleb, however, went to Silas. He stood before the seated man, his small face serious. He reached out a hesitant hand and touched the butt of the holstered pistol. "You saved us," Caleb said, his voice full of awe. Silas looked at the boy, and a faint, tired smile touched his lips. It was the first time Lena had ever seen him truly smile. He gently covered Caleb's small hand with his own. "No," he said, his voice soft. "Your mother saved us." That night, a new contract was sealed. Not with words, but with a simple act. When Lena served the thin rabbit stew, she no longer set his bowl on the floor by his pallet. She set a place for him at the table, between herself and Caleb. He hesitated for only a moment before he moved from the floor and took the seat. It was a small change, a few feet of distance, but it shifted the entire geography of their lives. He was no longer a guest, a patient, a grateful stranger. He was at the table. He was part of the circle. Weeks turned into a month. The prairie autumn bled into a pale, cold winter. The threat of Brand's return hung in the air, a distant thundercloud, but he did not come back. The humiliation, it seemed, had been a more potent weapon than any gun. The quiet routine of their lives resumed, but it was different. The silence was easier now, comfortable. They were stitching their lives together with threads of shared work and quiet companionship. He taught Caleb to mend harnesses. She taught him how to bake bread that didn't come out like a stone. One evening, as a bitter wind howled outside, they sat by the fire. The children were asleep. The only sounds were the crackle of the logs and the moan of the wind. "He called you Eleanor's replacement," Lena said softly, not looking at him, her hands busy mending a tear in Caleb's shirt. It was the first time the name had been spoken between them since the night of his nightmare. Silas stared into the flames for a long time. "She was gentle," he said finally, his voice low. "She liked books and gardens. This world would have broken her," he paused. "You are not her replacement. You are nothing like her. You are stronger than anyone I have ever known." It was the most he had ever said at once. It was a declaration, a testament. Lena's needle stilled in her hands. She finally looked at him and saw in his face the truth of his words. He was not looking at her as a substitute for a ghost. He was seeing her. Lena. That winter he gave her a gift. He had traded his silver belt buckle with a passing trapper for 2 thick wool blankets and a small sack of real flour. When he presented them to her, she simply stared, speechless. It was more wealth than she had seen in a year. "You can't stay here forever, Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The world will come looking for you again." "Let it," he said. "I'm not running anymore. Everything I need is right here." His gaze was steady, unwavering. It held a question, a hope so fragile it was almost painful to see. She didn't have to answer. He could see it in her eyes. The spring came, and with it a symbolic rebirth. Together, they rebuilt the section of fence that had been trampled by Brand's horses. They turned the soil in the garden, and this time it was rich and dark, amended with ash from the fire and compost he had taught her to make. They planted seeds. As Lena pressed a small bean into the earth, she felt a flicker of hope that was real and solid, not just a desperate prayer. The house no longer felt like a shelter against the world, but a home rooted in it. It breathed again. One day, a circuit rider, a preacher making his rounds, stopped at the homestead. He was a kind man with gentle eyes. He shared their lunch and spoke of God's grace. As he was preparing to leave, he looked at Lena, then at Silas, who was playing with May, lifting her into the air as she shrieked with laughter. "The good Lord works in mysterious ways," the preacher said to Lena quietly. "He brings comfort to the widowed and a home to the lost." He paused. "It is not my place to judge, but a family is a sacred thing. It ought to be bound by name and law as well as by heart." Lena looked at Silas. He had heard. He stood May on the ground and walked over, his expression serious. "Ma'am," he said to Lena, ignoring the preacher. "I have no fortune to offer you. The man I was is gone. All I have are my 2 hands and a name that has brought you nothing but trouble. But if you would have me, I would be honored to be your husband, to be a father to your children." He did not kneel. He did not offer a ring. He offered himself. All that he was and all that he wasn't. Lena looked at her children, their faces bright with life. She looked at this man, this stranger who had stumbled into her life half dead and had somehow brought it back from the brink. She thought of the long, lonely year after Thomas, the silence, the hunger. And she looked at the life they had built here, in the quiet spaces, with unspoken kindnesses and shared burdens. "Silas," she said, and her voice was clear and strong. "My name is Lena." It was a reminder and an acceptance. "And yes, I will have you." They were married that afternoon under the vast prairie sky, with the preacher as a witness and the children as their attendants. There were no rings, only the joining of two scarred hands. There were no vows, only a simple promise spoken in the wind. The final image of their story was not one of passion or drama. It was one of profound peace. It was the four of them on the small porch in the evening, watching the sun bleed a blood-orange promise across the horizon. Silas sat in a chair he had repaired, with May asleep in his lap. Caleb sat on the steps, leaning against his new father's knee. And Lena stood behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder. The house was solid at their backs. The garden was green with new life. The land, once a barren enemy, was now simply their home. They were a family, forged not in a church or by law, but in the fire of shared hardship and the quiet grace of a second chance. They had found each other in the ruins, and together they had built something new. This story, it isn't just about a rescue on some dusty plain. It's a story about the maps we carry inside us, the landscapes of our own grief and loss. We all have our prairies, those vast, empty places where we feel isolated, where the wind of hardship seems determined to wear us down to nothing. We think we're alone out there. We believe the silence. But the world is a strange and mysterious place. Sometimes, when we are at our most broken, when we have nothing left to give, we stumble upon another soul who is just as lost. And in the simple, terrifying act of offering what little we have, a cup of water, a word of kindness, a moment of shared silence, we find the one thing we thought was gone forever. We find a reason. So here is your naming. That person who saves you might not ride in on a white horse. They might crawl to your door, wounded and in need of saving themselves. And your salvation might not look like a grand gesture. It might look like mending a fence. It might sound like the scrape of a chair at a dinner table where a place has been set for you. It might feel like a warm blanket on a cold night. Love doesn't always shout. Most of the time, it whispers. It shows up and does the dishes. It stands between you and the thing you're afraid of. It lays wildflowers on the graves of those you've lost. It's a quiet, stubborn thing. A choice you make and then remake every single day. If you are brave enough to open your door to a stranger, brave enough to share your last crust of bread, brave enough to stand your ground on a small patch of dirt you call home, you might just find you haven't built a shelter. You've built a world.